Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Podshop, your podcast for learning about all things podcasting, how to do it, the ins and outs, the ups and downs. I'm Jeremy Shear, one of the hosts of the show. I'm also the founder and CEO of Connversa. We are a podcast agency specializing in B2B podcasting. Great to be here with you. And I'm here with my co-host, Kaitlyn Clays, who's one of our producers. Hey, Kaitlyn, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. And we have a special guest today, another one of our producers, Michael Birchfield. Michael, welcome to the Pod Shop.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so Michael, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, how you got into doing podcast stuff.
All right. Yeah, sure. So I'm Michael Birchfield. I am a producer for Connversa, also sometimes video editor, audio editor, whatever the client needs. I also work for the Interstellar Research Group as the deputy of publicity, outreach, and social media. I'm also the head of the committee for the podcast From Here to the Stars and YouTube series for the Interstellar Research Group. And I've got a background of 8 years in communication and radio.
Okay, very cool. The Interstellar Research Group, does this basically mean like searching for alien life?
Nope. It is not searching for alien life. We interview scientists and bring together discussions at our symposiums on how we'll travel from planet to planet. So it's very much technology based and moving forward on the human side of how we can get eventually to open up, the stars.
Maybe with time you could get some interstellar communication radio waves.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. That's cool. It's like a real life Star Trek sort of exploring the stars, right?
Yeah, we've been around for a while now, and we always had great discussion. I mean, it was started off of people just sitting down together, and they're like, "Oh, we should invite more people to this." People with different backgrounds just talking with each other. So it's really grown a lot in the last couple of years.
That's pretty cool. Well, look, I'd be happy to have a whole discussion just about interplanetary travel, but we'll save that for another podcast, because what we want to talk about today is what you do specifically. What does it mean to be a podcast producer? I think a lot of people are maybe a little fuzzy on that, or they think like, well, I guess that must mean editing. And yeah, it involves editing, but it's so much more than that. So that's our topic today. What is a podcast producer? What does a podcast producer actually do? So let's just start right there, Michael. I'm going to throw that question right over to you. How do you explain what it is that you do when people ask?
Well, you're absolutely right. A lot of people think that it's just editing, background work, not really hands-on. It's, you see the host, you don't see the producer. So what the producer does, it helps coach the host, coach the guests, get everybody comfortable, helps with scheduling, writing show notes, social assets, video editing, creating promos, and just correspondence between the host and the guest to make the show really the best it could be.
Okay, so much more than editing. It's stuff that happens before you record, also what happens after you record in post-production, right? So it's it's involved in really a good producer in every aspect of producing a podcast, not just working with the audio or video.
That's correct. But working with audio and video, we do as well. But a lot of it is troubleshooting. So,
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've got a question, Michael. So you mentioned just like an array of things that a producer covers. So you obviously wear many hats. I have a question about, what do you think a client benefits most from by having a producer? You get to help out with emails and like all of the other things you mentioned, but what do you think they appreciate the very most?
well, for most of these podcasts, most of our podcasts, our clients have a lot more than just this. They have a lot more on their plate than just the podcast. It's one part of the daily life. So a podcast producer really focuses 24/7 on the podcast. Any questions you have, any ideas or thoughts, you can bounce them off of. They're really able to take a step back and take a look at the podcast as a whole, instead of, being right up on it, because sometimes you miss things when you're looking at it. But I think the value of having a podcast host is just to help coach you through The podcast itself, each episode, if they see you being stiff, they say, "Hey, don't be stiff." I'm very blunt with my host, and I think that adds a lot of value to what I do. And then also troubleshooting, because when things hit the fan, it took me years to be able to calmly assess the situation, keep everybody comfortable while trying to troubleshoot the problem at the same time, and rescheduling if we have to. But the main thing is, keeping everybody's heads on straight, keeping the podcast, keeping the show on the right rails, and that's a big part of it.
Okay, so you've mentioned troubleshooting a couple times now. Give us some examples of the kind of problems that can crop up and the role that you play as a producer to help solve them.
Yeah, we just recently had a problem where, for some reason, our recording applications updated, and it didn't like our other host. It just didn't like his camera. It didn't like anything he was doing. It was kicking him out, and so that was very frustrating for the guest, for the host himself. And I had to say, "Hey, it's okay. We'll figure this out." We eventually found a solution of just turning off the camera and recording it that way, and I had a great time. But it's things like that that can occur, that really start spinning people's heads around and get them real frustrated.
Okay, great example. So there are like technical problems that crop up that you have to know how to deal with. And if you're not working with a producer or like a technical person who knows how to solve that stuff, it can just be a real nightmare, right? Like you're just like, we have no idea what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Like with my experience, I'm able to see everything kind of like on a level, on a different level, where I can see what's happening. I know what's happening in the background. I know what, kind of camera everybody's using. I can see what kind of audio equipment everybody's using. I can see the data coming through to figure out exactly what the problem is.
One thing that I think is so important about the producer role, and Michael, like, feel free to speak on this as well, but I really think that having a producer also helps with your time management. And, like, for example, say someone didn't have your technical skill set where you're seeing, oh, your microphone's a little low, why don't you move it closer? Troubleshooting, essentially, like you're saying. It would take so much longer to record an entire episode and then have to completely re-record because of simple errors that could be fixed on like the spot. Do you have any thoughts to like go on that as well as like that on that kind of thought process?
Oh yeah. I think the coaching is a big aspect to it as well, because people don't know, they think they're being professional, and being professional can not always be engaging to the audience. So I have to stop sometimes and be like, "Hey, open up a little more. It's okay. We'll have some fun. I'm here to make you look good. And so we're going to make this the best possible. And right now, you need to open up a little
hmm
more."
That's interesting, Michael. I actually want to explore that a little bit because I think one thing that we found, and you've probably found this too, is the nature of the relationship between a producer and especially the host of the podcast is really important. How you're both like your working relationship and just how you relate to each other as people, because as you just described, I think a really important thing that the producer does is provide coaching and feedback specifically to the host about how they're performing. And it can be tough to get notes, especially to essentially take criticism, even if it's constructive. Like, hey, you need to loosen up a little bit. If that's not delivered in the right way, or you don't have a strong relationship, people can get offended, or they might not trust you. Like, you really have to develop trust with the person you're working with. There has to be that bond of trust between the host and the producer. So, what are your thoughts on that? And a more specific question is, how do you develop that trust with the people you're working with?
I would say that everyone's different, of course. So every situation is going to be different, but it's really just getting them all the technical stuff, like being very open with them, even if they don't understand it, showing them, everything that's going on, staying in touch with them, keeping on the base, keeping on the right track. And just as you go into things, be very, understanding that this is their first time probably doing this. And, so it's really flexibility is very important. making sure that the host is comfortable, that the podcast is on track, and that they can see everything that's kind of going on. So they have that kind of comfortability with it.
So what about a situation where the host apparently thinks they're doing awesome, but you're sitting there listening and being like, they need to loosen up, or this could be better. You know, you've already described, sometimes you'll cut in or provide feedback, be like, hey, loosen up, but say more about that. Like, how do you give notes in a way that's going to get the kind of results you're looking for?
I am very blunt. My approach is probably different from most people's, as I'm very honest and open with the people that I work with. Sometimes they like it, sometimes they don't, but they eventually understand my personality and realize that I'm trying to work to make them better and working towards the same goal of making the best podcast. So I will stop them and say, hey, this kind of sucks. Like, let's open this up a little more. You know, let's try this. Let's go this way. Instead of thinking about it this way, like you're trying to be a professional on a conference call right now. I don't want you on a conference call. I want you sitting in a room at a table with somebody having drinks. Like, you know, I don't suggest alcohol, but like the thought of you having a normal conversation with somebody, you know, is kind of how I try to lead them down the right path to making the best engaging content.
I do have a note to add on that a little bit too. So something that's interesting. So I'm coming from like a film and voiceover background when like working at Connversa as well. But one thing that's really interesting is that the way we've consumed media, like around in the early 2000s and 90s, even going into 80s, it was very like performative speaking was what was on the radio, what was on TV. It's like, go get your car sales, da da da. And so very like tonal and very salesy, if you will. Now, what has been very interesting that I found is that people are desiring and consuming more media that is conversational, that is not that conference speaking, like, you know, button up, tied to the neck. It's been very much people loving to hear just natural conversation, which I think is a very cool development, and you can analyze it hundreds of different ways. So I think also focusing on keeping that tone conversational and personable is one of the most important and cool things about podcasting.
Absolutely. And the trends have changed. I mean, trends change all the time. You know, podcasting is a constant evolution, like, because the way people consume media and is constantly changing. So at first, people like to hear people that were professional, you know, in the conversation. They want to hear somebody that's professional in their field. Nowadays, they want people they can relate to more. I mean, you can even see it on, you know, television. They want, you know, that's why I think like the, what's it called? The real life dramas where they're watching people is so popular. You know, they just like to see normal people. Exactly.
Yeah.
Reality TV. They just like to see people having the same struggles so they don't feel so, I guess, alone in themselves. So having a conversation where it sounds like you're sitting around the table with these people and you're able to relate better nowadays, that's the trend right now anyways, but that can always change.
But you know, you guys, Kaitlyn, you bring up, I think, a really a good point, an important point. In fact, I posted on LinkedIn just this morning about this very topic, and it was about like, do you like the sound of your own voice? You know, how important is it on a podcast to sound quote unquote professional, like a professional broadcaster? And my point was like, it's actually not. You do not need to adopt a certain kind of professional, you know, broadcaster voice. And in fact, you don't want to, because the buzzword is authentic, right? Authenticity. That gets tossed around a lot. Exactly what that means is an interesting discussion in and of itself. But I think in what people really mean when they say that, and I think especially for podcasting, and I think podcasting has kind of always been like this, and what makes it good is people just being themselves. It's just like kind of random people now recording stuff and broadcasting it and just being themselves, talking about whatever they're interested in, whether it's D&D or movies or business or whatever. You know, it's not overly produced to the point that it all kind of sounds the same, like newscasters used to, you know, back in the heyday of TV news, like I'm Tom Brokaw in today's nightly news, or like Ron Burgundy, right? That's the whole joke
Yes.
of those movies. Like Ron Burgundy just sounds like the real deal, but he's a total idiot, underneath. And podcasting is, I think, the charm of it, and really the part of the great value is kind of the opposite of that. It's a kind of more unguarded medium where people are not as worried about having a trained voice, and it's more about bringing energy to a discussion and putting stuff out there that you wouldn't hear from NBC News or some outlet that's just more buttoned down, where there's more production. That's what's fun about it.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. We have a lot of fun in all our podcasts, and that's the main point I try to stress, is to have fun. I mean, because that's the kind of content people like to hear.
Yeah. So I have another question. So, Michael, I know you spend a lot of time with clients who have never done a podcast before. And so you're really involved from the get-go in building it from the ground up. So to your mind, what are the key core ingredients for a successful podcast? What have you learned about that?
The core ingredients are to have enough time to properly put it out there on social media and really talk about it. Because you can't just start a podcast and expect, oh, tomorrow I'm going to have this third episode out and there's going to be 200,000 followers, right? So you really have to be willing to make yourself social, put yourself out there and create engaging content. I think engaging the listener is probably the most important part of the puzzle, just because that could make or break you, and that can make or break the host and the people that are, and the guests and that kind of thing. So having the proper amount of time to actually get the podcast out there. And that's, why we like to suggest having a couple episodes lined up. I mean, it's no secret that the suggestions for starting a podcast is to have at least 3 episodes already done and ready to release once you get out there.
Yeah. I mean, Kaitlyn, I think I want to ask, you a question here, because I think Michael mentioned 2 really important things there that are related, obviously. One is engaging the listener, right? And that, of course, depends on who the listener is and what you're talking about, right? But I think that basically means calibrating what you're talking about to the needs and interests of the listener, right? Really knowing your audience and taking the time to do some research there, right? So that you're talking about things that that audience cares about. But the other super important point, as Michael mentioned, is promoting it, specifically on social media. I mean, promoting it as much as you can. But Kaitlyn, this is, this really falls into your purview a lot. You're a creator, you're on social media, you're really good at building channels and engaging with people on social. So what's your take on promoting a podcast on social media? Like, what does that look like? What do you need to do to make that work?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to approach it, but I do love this topic. And one, engaging. We can talk about what does engagement mean. There's 2 things that come to mind for me, and one thing that I just know from experience is that video content is a way more popular, and it's just on the rise, just as TikTok is on the rise. So engaging content is typically, to me, people seeing your face, seeing your reaction. Jeremy says something outlandish and Michael and I react. Like, people are interested in seeing like that reaction and that human communication, essentially. So I think of engagement video wise is always a win. And the other thing I think of with engagement is humor. I think that's just typically where my wheelhouse goes to, because yes, humans are very multifaceted. Yes, they can be business professionals, but they're still humans at the end of the day. And everyone likes to relate. And the quickest way you can relate to an audience is by making them laugh. Is it easy? Not necessarily. But if you know, again, what your audience's interests are. So, like, what questions does your audience have? For example, our audience is typically people who are interested in podcasting. So what we can do, like, for just using this as an example, is analyze what questions do they have. So, for example, we covered this in a previous episode of the Podshop. Go check out Josh Hale's episode about microphones. But for example, that was a question that a lot of new podcasters have, is what equipment should I have? Well, that has gotten some pretty good engagement, but that's an example of knowing your audience. What are their interests? What do they have questions about? And how can you interact with them, whether that be putting on events or scheduling a call? Those are some of the first few things. And I won't take up more of Michael's time on this interview, but that's just just a scratch at the surface of like what engagement with your audience can look like in a
Mm-hmm.
podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and the guest can help be engaging as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of our upcoming podcasts, our guest is an author, and we're giving away books. So that's
Oh,
another way to
cool.
engage
Mm-hmm.
your audience and get more people for the guest to listen to that follow his books.
So Kaitlyn brought up a really interesting point, using humor as a way to engage people on social media. And that speaks, I think, to the larger the larger question of how do you entertain people? People are gonna gravitate towards content that's not just informative but fun and entertaining. Which entertaining is a broad term; it can mean a lot of different things. But Michael, let me throw that to you. Um, how important do you think it is for podcasts to be entertaining, whatever you take that to mean? And that's part one. And part two is, what can our people like our clients do? And we're talking about, marketers at B2B companies, right? Um, what can you do to make those podcasts not just informative, but also actually fun to listen to?
Well, I think going into the background of the guest and the host and making it more relatable to people, like so that people understand they're not just this omnipresent voice on the other side of this radio or device that they're listening to, but that they have a little bit of personality and they're able to humanize and relate to them. I think that's a way to do it. And then, like Kaitlyn said, humor. So I wouldn't begin to know some
Mm-hmm.
of the humorous insights, like I guess you would say the inside conversation of these different organizations and their different, um, jokes and that kind of thing. It's inside baseball for some of them. So it's really about getting the host to open up with that kind of information.
I have a question for you. Michael. There's like we've covered troubleshooting. We've covered all of the different ways that you can create content to be engaging within the episode even, and like what people are looking for from hosts. But I think that's pretty fun, but I want to know, what is your favorite part about being a producer, or what is your favorite part of the process when producing an episode?
I love talking with people, honestly, meeting new people, talking with the host, and really it's at the end of the day, seeing a great episode mixed, mastered, edited, put together, something I could really be proud of. I love what I do because of the people I work with and the products that I bring to fruition. I love being proud. I like hearing that, the episode at the end of the day, I'm like, yep, I helped make that. Really enjoying your work and really enjoying the job is 100% everything.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, one takeaway for me from this discussion, and I think it's a really good discussion, is that for a podcast to be successful, as we've been talking about, it needs to bring a certain kind of energy. It needs to be informative, educational, but also entertaining, which is not easy to do. And so much of that has to do with the rapport between the host and the guest, and especially the host opening up and being real and maybe even being a little vulnerable. And at the end of the day, it's really the producer plays such a big role in helping a host get there, because it's a little bit of, I think in a way, is a little bit of a paradox. Like, we're saying on the one hand, well, just be natural, be you, right? Don't try to sound a certain way. But on the other hand, you are talking into a mic and you are assuming the role of a podcast host, like you are putting on the show, right? So it's not literally just flipping on the mic and just starting to talk, right? There is preparation. And so that's really where the producer comes in, to give you those guidelines and to episode by episode give you pointers and notes for how to be yourself and be natural and connect with an audience in a kind of focused way. That's an art and a science, and it takes time to do. And if you have a good producer who you're working with who can provide guidance, then that can be just hugely valuable in terms of getting you where you want to go. That's a big takeaway for me.
Yeah. And going off of that too, I suppose like my take on will be like a build on to what you're saying, but like for a client or for like an aspiring host, you don't know what you don't know. So I personally, like when I first started podcasting, I was really critical and kind of hard on myself. But basically what was taught to me was go back, listen to the episodes that you recorded. And it was so grueling to hear it first, because listening to the sound of your own voice when you're not used to it yet can be a little bit like, oh, why did my voice crack there? And you can be very critical. But one of the things is just you don't know what you don't know. And so what you can do is go back and learn and then talk to the producer. What notes do the producer have for you? How can allow them to help you? Because don't think of it as, you know, yourself versus the producer when they give you feedback or, you know, critical feedback or something like that on how you can improve. Just think of it more as a collaboration and like, what can we do to work together to make the next episode better? Because that's what you want to do, is just you at least want to beat the last episode. You want each, like, just all that little bit of increase of performance. Like you'll have a completely different show from your first episode to your 50th.
Yeah, great point, Kaitlyn. Michael, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think everything that Kaitlyn said is 100% true. A producer can also help you get out to the different platforms. Apple Podcasts, they know this technical stuff, how to help build a web page, how to break down how to get to Spotify, to Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, all the platforms that you're looking to hit. You know, they can really help you out there. And I think that was just something that we kind of washed over, but it's very important nonetheless.
Well, that kind of brings us to a conclusion on today's episode. Everyone, this was so much fun. And now thank you all for going ahead and coming in and listening to this episode with Michael and learning a bit more about producing. I hope you enjoyed the takeaways and have a few of yourself. In fact, why don't you go ahead and comment below what your biggest takeaway was from this episode? But for now, I think it's time to say goodbye, so I will go ahead and read us out. Our socials are Connversa Podcasting on TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, and let's see, where else are we? We have a website, Connversa.com, and that's spelt with 2 N's, by the way. And then make sure to follow us here on your favorite podcasting platform. Be sure to follow, and we will see you again next time.
Bye-bye.